The music did not stop. Everything stopped. Crystal chandeliers trembled as if holding their breath. On the marble floor, a glassy pool of light threw a perfect, glittering circle around the people nearest the stage. Conversation thinned into the soft rustle of silk, the clicking of heels, a collective intake of air. In the center of that light stood Victoria Adabio, shining in a couture gown, flawless hair, a smile that had been trained to do damage, and at her heels a waiter whose apron had one nervous crease too many, and whose hands would not stop shaking. She pointed, not with curiosity but with accusation, and the room folded inward. "This is unacceptable," she said, voice cold as the ice in the champagne flutes. "How can anyone be so careless? We can't have this at my engagement party." The waiter's eyes went to the floor. He stammered, tried to explain about the misplaced bag, about the excitement, and about how he'd been on his feet since dawn. But Victoria's voice tightened. Each word clipped him like a blade. "You're fired," she declared, the sentence landing before the music could swallow it back. A murmur rolled through the crowd. Tables fell silent. The band saxophone note hung like a question mark. A new assistant, small in the room, but steady in stance, stepped forward. Ngoy Nangquo had been at the estate only days, her plain uniform a private defiance among the gowns. She moved the way people who have been careful with disappointment move, slow, clean, without spectacle. She stood between the waiter and the glare of the room, as if she were the hinge of a door, and she spoke not to shame anyone, but to reframe the moment. "Please," she said, voice clear but not loud. "He's been working hard. It was an accident. There are better ways to fix this." The word "please" at a ballroom full of entitled echoes did something strange. It snapped attention like a wire. Heads turned, toward the waiter, toward Victoria, and finally toward the balcony where Emeka Okafor had paused halfway down the curved staircase. He had been stepping into the night, into the ritual of photos and handshakes, but he lingered, unsettled. For a man who had been trained to expect deference, the room's tilt surprised him. Victoria's lips tightened. Her eyes flashed with the calm cruelty that had made her feared in the staff quarters and on social feeds alike. She had a reputation, sharp, precise, and relentless. Staff whispered that no one wanted to be on the wrong side of her temper. But Ngoy, with her hands folded, one holding a tray, the other empty, did something more unnerving than defiance. She offered dignity to someone who had none. If you love powerful character-driven stories, hit like and subscribe. Guests leaned in as if drawn by a thread. The head of events cleared his throat. The security chief looked for protocol, and a hush stretched like the shadow under a door. Victoria inhaled, then sharpened her smile. She had never been stopped in public before. The gap between entitlement and accountability narrowed the space around her like a narrowing throat. "Who is she?" someone whispered. "New assistant," another answered. "Just started." Ngoy met Victoria's stare without spectacle. "There are ways to train and correct," she said. "Firing him tonight won't help anyone. If you want, I can check the CCTV and speak to the team. We can fix this." Victoria's jaw worked. The ring on her finger flashed when she clenched her hand, an emblem of status, an announcement of the life she and Emeka were to share. She liked control. She liked to make mistakes costly for others and harmless for herself. But in a room full of glitter, a small, steady voice was suddenly something she could not ignore. Emeka watched until the tension became a question he had to answer. From the balcony, the polished man who built hotels and curated experiences felt a tug at a place he had not visited in years. The small, patient teachings of Mama Chenier. He had heard them in the evenings when his grandmother would sit him on her knee and name the difference between wealth and worth. That memory came now as a small shock. Lessons about how you treated the hands that served the table mattered, and that prestige without conscience was a hollow thing. He descended the final steps with that memory growing like a pulse. The immediate fallout carried its own velocity. People rearranged themselves. Cameras that had been trained on the couple's planned kiss now found a new narrative. Staff who had once swallowed indignities under Victoria's gaze remembered the sharp stings and the small mortifications. A dozen private slights became visible in their faces. The way a maid had been scolded for a crease in a napkin, the way a gardener had been dismissed for late pruning, the way shifts had been scheduled to test loyalty. The waiter, cheeks wet with the near dawn of humiliation, gave a frightened smile when Ngoy touched his sleeve gently and guided him away from the center. "We'll sort it," she told him. "Come with me." Victoria's mouth thinned into a white line. "You will not question me," she said. The edge in her voice had the weight of precedent. She had not been questioned in public, and she had mastered the art of shrinking people until they fit into the frame she preferred. Ngoy did not argue or hesitate. Her correction was practical. She took the waiter's name, promised to review the footage, and asked that he remain until the end of the evening. Her calm was not submission. It was a careful, civil refusal to be complicit with cruelty. To some watching, guests, staff, and Amika, her small act looked less like audacity and more like the courage of someone who had a deeper reason to fight quietly.
A week earlier, Ngoy had taken on this job for reasons that belonged to the distance between cities. A phone call that kept a mother awake, a letter asking for school fees, siblings who were not set up to fail. She had arrived at the estate with a battered suitcase, a folder of references, and the sort of measured hope that men and women in service carry like secret scripture. The staff room had introduced her in whispers, the way a ship introduces a new crew member, cautious, observant, protective. "You'll learn how she is," the head housekeeper had said. "She likes people to know their place." Ngoy had nodded. She listened more than she spoke, learning routes through rooms and the language of expectations. She watched Victoria on first impressions, the way she tested people like a seamstress tests fabric, pulling at threads to see where the tear would appear. There were rumors, as there always are in households crowded with power. A chef moved to tears over being publicly corrected, a waiter disciplined for a misplaced reservation, a gardener reprimanded until his hands trembled. Ngoy took them in and stored them. She did not let the stories harden her. Instead, she kept a ledger of what mattered most: the faces of her family, the tuition dates, the small emergency fund she fed with overtime. She worked long hours for long-sighted reasons. Sometimes, in the quiet before dawn, she would call home and listen to her brother's voice cut through static. "Are you okay?" they would ask. She would smile against silence and say yes, because saying otherwise made them worry. The truth was layered and quiet. She missed the smell of the rains back home. She missed the small market where women bartered. She missed the laughter around meals she could no longer afford to say no to. But she had a small, constant prayer toward the future, that doing the right thing now would deliver those people from a daily humiliation she knew too well. On the night of the lost designer handbag, tension had been stretched taut by small things: a late shipment, an unexpected bouquet, a guest list that had grown in the last fevered weeks. Victoria's mood had been a litany of minor offenses: the glass not polished enough, the waiter a shade too slow, the tablecloth misaligned by a sliver. She did not see people. She saw a landscape of errors waiting for her verdict. The handbag had arrived like a flare. Victoria discovered it when an assistant fumbled and placed it on a chair near a waiter who had been juggling plates and late-night requests. The purse, expensive and distinct, had belonged to the fiancé's friend. "Who handled this?" Victoria demanded, eyes flashing. The moment amplified. In her chest, anger moved like a current, and she turned that current into a command. The unfortunate waiter became a scapegoat, because the world always needed one. When Victoria raised her hand, an attempt at a slap that called back to the days when she could control the tide of fear with a single gesture, Ngoy stepped in. She did not own drama. She did not throw herself outward in a grandstanding defense. She simply put her hand on Victoria's wrist, fingers enclosing, and stopped the move. The room inhaled. The attempted humiliation had stalled. A hand catches another hand, and the world sees two things at once: the intention to harm and the refusal to be harmed. That catch, the soft closing of fingers around the precarious flourish, served as a moral hinge. Something shifted in the air. Staff eyes filled with a long-suppressed gratitude, and Victoria's face changed from practiced control to a crack of panic. Her smile, so accustomed to slicing, was not as steady. The facade slipped. At that moment, Mama Chenier entered, the kind of woman whose presence had always been a soft, steady law in this household. She had raised Amika in the ways that money could not buy: lessons of humility, the importance of seeing people, the gravity of restitution. Her hair was more silver now, and her voice had the sediment of years. She saw the scene like a person reading a page quickly and understanding the whole story. "Enough," Mama Chenier said. The single word did more than call for decorum. It invoked a history: the back rooms where promises were broken, the alleys of small cruelties, the lives made fragile by a public lover of spectacle. She did not shout. She did not scold in a way meant to humiliate. She named what had been happening in a way that summoned accountability. Victoria shrunk under that naming. Her panic became a quiet thing, and then a flaring vulnerability. A phone vibrated in her clutch. A text slid across the screen of someone in the crowd, anonymous, insistent. A voice in the back murmured, "Is that a message from Port Harcourt?" The name Port Harcourt landed like an old weather report.
It had been a place where a younger Victoria had worked, where people rise and fall on currency of trust, where a manager's ledger could be the difference between a school term paid and a child dropped out. The idea that a past in Port Harcourt could return with teeth made the assembled guests fidget. An anonymous call, a terse message, then another, then a quiet stone tossed into a pond, the sound of teeth against glass. People leaned closer as if they could watch a fault in the ground split and reveal what lay beneath. Victoria's composure cracked. She retreated to a quiet corner, and someone guided her phone under a low lamp. Her breath came short. In fast staccato confessions, hair loose, mascara a little blurred, she admitted that 3 years earlier she had taken money from a hotel account in Port Harcourt. She thought she was owed more than she had been paid, she said. She had been in need. The voice that had once been the voice of command now trembled, brittle.
It was one thing to speak of mistakes in the abstract. It was another to be known by them in a room full of people. Admissions have gravity. They attract consequences the way light attracts moths. And this admission pulled a man into the light like an answering flare. Chukwu Obi burst into the ballroom as if he had been cold by a magnet. He was not an angry man by nature. He was someone who lived with the consequences of small decisions turned enormous. He had once been the manager who trusted his books to a subordinate, who had his life rearranged when the account went thin. Chukwu's children had been sent home from school in the years that followed. His wages dropped. His dignity had been pawned piece by piece. He had hounded the situation in ways that were more about trying to hold a life together than to seek revenge. He stood now with a piece of paper, old receipts, photocopies of bank transfers, the kind of data that, when brought to polite rooms, has the effect of a small, methodical sword. He did not storm. He did not raise his voice. He stood, let his collection of facts do its work, and asked, quietly, with a grief poor men carry, "Will you repay what was taken?" The room that had held pageantry and pretense now held the accountability of lives intersecting. Amika, who had watched from the staircase and heard the piano's note fall out of tune, now had to make a choice that was more telling than any choreography. Wealth allowed him options. Conscience pressed him to choose one that would not be convenient. He called his lawyer, right then, at the party. He asked for the exact amount to be repaid. He asked for the records to be gathered and for restitution to be immediate. When the number was read, 10 million naira, a life-ravaging amount, he did not hesitate. In the middle of the ornate ballroom, while guests looked on with the curiosity of commerce, Amika offered to pay Chukwu the full amount on the spot. The act of paying was not a spectacle. It was a short, deliberate motion. Signature, transfer, handshake. There were papers. There were forms to be signed. A bank transfer that would take hours to process, but a decision made in a minute. Where spectacle had been Victoria's currency, Amika exchanged it for quiet repair. He also, with the gravity of someone who had just done a thing he had not been asked to do, told Victoria the engagement was off. He did not gloat. He did not savor retribution. He said simply, "I cannot marry someone who is willing to hurt another person for profit." The sentence landed not as punishment but as principle. He insisted on truth and restitution rather than the tolerance of corruption. He wanted a relationship based on integrity, not on appearance. Some in the room shifted in relief. Some looked shocked. Victoria's implosion was not to be mocked. She had to live with the consequences of her admission. Mama Janir did not clap. She placed a hand on Amika's forearm and nodded the way elders do when praise is unnecessary. The nod held the weight of gratitude steered toward moral clarity. There was more to do than a single transfer. Chukwu needed the money not only as a moral balm, but as practical supply. School fees back in place, rent stabilized, dignity restored. Amika ensured there would be the paperwork, official restitution, counseling for Victoria, a repayment plan for any remaining sums, and where necessary, employment records corrected. The law did not need to rage that night. Prudence and paperwork were sufficient for immediate repair. Victoria did not leave the room unheard, or simply escorted away in shame. She agreed, wounded, reluctant, raw, to undergo counseling and to make amends in the ways that were required. Public accountability had been named, and she accepted that there would be consequences beyond the annulled engagement, financial arrangements, reputational rebuilding, and a willingness, however fragile, to accept help for patterns that had caused harm. Chukwu, when the night fell and the lights dimmed, stood at the edge of the balcony and looked out over the estate. He held the small envelope of papers like a talisman, a physical thing that signified we had not simply watched cruelty, we had corrected it. He thought of his children's faces.
He imagined them back in classrooms, their uniforms neat. The money would not be affixed to the pain of the years spent scavenging stability, but it would allow a new chapter, an ability to stand again. Nongoy's part in all of this was never theatrical. She did not demand applause. She cleaned plates the next morning as if she had not been the pivot on which an important change turned. The staff whispered about her courage, but Nongoy held her head in that private way of people who prefers acts to accolades. Amika, though, understood he owed her more than words. He called her into his study the next day and thanked her, not with a public display, but with an honest recognition and a small tangible gift, a permanent position with better pay and a recommendation that carried weight. He insisted she be given the support she needed to continue her schooling contributions back home, and he arranged for some of the estate's charitable initiatives to quietly fund projects her family needed. Mama Chenier watched these moves with a woman's tempered satisfaction. Her prayer had been less about spectacle and more about the slow work of mending. She had always believed in restoration that preserved dignity, not humiliation that destroyed it. She visited Chukwo at his modest home, not to lecture, but to listen. She set up a small committee to help the staff voice grievances without fear. To Amika, she said, "You've done well, but remember, money can fix what's broken materially. It cannot teach what one's heart has not learned." Victoria, in the weeks that followed, did not vanish into anonymity.
She accepted counseling and worked through restitution plans. There were public statements and private meetings. She met with Chukwo face-to-face, more than once, and apologized, first hesitantly, then with a vulnerability that surprised both of them. In one meeting, she offered a repayment plan and an apology that did not ask for forgiveness as entitlement, but requested it as a hope. Chukwo, carrying his own scars, accepted the money and the apology, and together they signed documents that, while practical, also had the symbolic power of two people confronting harm and choosing repair. The process was not neat. There were tears. There were nights when Victoria hated herself for what she had done, but she did not run. She stayed and tried to be accountable. The staff felt the aftershocks of the night in quieter ways. Schedules were adjusted to include fair shift practices. A staff grievance box was instituted, and more than one house steward found the courage to file complaints that had been lodged in silence for years. The head of events, who had once hovered on the edge of the crowd to maintain order, now found himself taking the work of listening seriously. The gardener, who had been scolded for pruning the wrong bush, got a talk and a smile instead of a reprimand. Little things changed, and these accumulated into larger currents. There was a day when Amika took Ngoy to see a small project the estate had funded in the neighboring town, a library where children could study, and a small scholarship board with donors' names inscribed. Ngoy watched the children run their fingers over books she could not have imagined owning a year before. For a moment, she let herself imagine a future where her family's worries were not the weight that defined them. When she turned back, Amika said, simply, "Thank you." She did not accept the thanks as someone who had done heroic things. She accepted it as someone who had done what she must. "I only did what was right," she answered. In the weeks after the confrontation, the way people looked at Ngoy had changed. The staff greeted her with a different tilt of respect. Guests who had once seen her as background noticed the steadiness in her face. She refused the spotlight but accepted the chance to be a mentor in the staff room. She helped train new hires on the simple dignity of the work, on how to hold yourself when the world expects you to be small. She spoke to the younger women in soft terms about how to be brave without having to be loud. Amika, for his part, spent more time with Mama Chenier. They walked in the garden, and sometimes he did not speak for a long time. When he did, his voice was calmer. "I used to think that influence was about being seen," he told her once. "I see now that it's about being steady when no one is watching." Mama Chenier squeezed his hand and said, "Influence is a light. It can warm or burn. Be careful how you turn it on."
Chukwo used the restitution to steady a life that had been fragile. The rent caught up, the children paid back into school, a small emergency fund started. But more than the money, he told people later, what mattered was that someone had chosen to listen when he had been ignored. The acknowledgement had repaired a wound as well as any check could. He went back to work with more assurance and began to take on training opportunities to reclaim managerial footing. He met with a career counselor funded by the estate's new vocational initiative and started mapping a path forward. Victoria's transformation was not immediate. Old habits cling with a tenacity made of fear and survival. She relapsed sometimes into old defensiveness. Yet the fact that she answered calls for counseling and signed restitution agreements distinguished guilt from growth. She learned to attend therapy sessions, to confront a pattern of thinking that had treated people as currency to be gambled. When she apologized publicly later, more contrite, more informed, her voice was smaller but less brittle. It was not an absolution. It was the start of an attempt. The estate itself reshaped in small, thoughtful ways. There were meetings about staff welfare, financial support for family emergencies formalized, and protocols created that ensured public humiliations could not be weaponized by anyone, regardless of partner status or social media image. The head of events instituted a mediation process that preferred restitution and learning over punitive dismissals. The changes were quiet, administrative, and perhaps the most practical proof that a single brave act can cascade into systems-level repair. A few days after the climax, at sunset, there was a soft scene in which the estate seemed to sigh with relief. Amika found Ngoy in the staff garden, pruning an herb for the kitchen. The sky was the color of warmed copper. The lights of the estate glowed like bookmarks. He stood watching her for a moment, not certain how to measure what had been corrected. "Come with me," he said simply, and they walked to the terrace where Mama Chenier waited with a thermos of tea and a plate of warm bread. It was a human, domestic picture that the earlier ballroom could not have held. 3 generations of moral authority, and 2 lives that had been linked by a single, unassuming act. "You changed the course of an evening," Amika said, voice low. "You changed more than that. You changed how I see what matters." Ngoy looked down at her hands, which still smelled faintly of soil. She was not given to grant speeches. "I only wanted to do the right thing," she said. "You did more," Mama Chenier said, smiling. "You reminded us that dignity is not a thing reserved for the wealthy." Ngoy's eyes registered something complicated, humility laced with the recognition that she had been used as a hinge for a decision she would not have sought. She didn't want credit. She wanted the people she loved to be safer.
But she also allowed herself to feel the quiet gratitude of being seen. The estate's final scenes were not cinematic fireworks, but small, steady harmonies. Chukwa's children were enrolled again. Victoria went to therapy and started a volunteer program that forced humility by proximity, working with people whose lives had been affected by her choices. She did not erase what had been done, but she tried to make amends. Ngoy received a modest honor from the staff, a dinner paid for by those who knew that dignity had been defended. She accepted a small, anonymous envelope from colleagues that would help with school fees. She laughed in a way that unknotted the tension in her face. Her life did not explode into fame. It adjusted into a quieter trajectory. Better pay, more security, and the steady satisfaction of labor that mattered. Amika made a point in subsequent months to visit the neighborhoods where the estate held projects. He moved beyond gifts and into structures, scholarships with accountable administration, training programs with measurable outcomes, a staff fund for emergencies that did not require humiliation to access. His wealth now carried the weight of an intention, to apply resources where they mattered, and to employ influence as a force for repair. People told the story in different registers. Guests at cocktail parties narrated the scene with the relish of gossip. Staff told it with the reverence of a lesson passed down from elders. Mama Chenier told it as an illustration for the young ones, a way to show that power without compassion is brittle, and that courage can come from the most ordinary of people. And in the end, the estate returned to its ritual rhythms, but a new current ran beneath them. The things that had been tolerated before were questioned. People learned to speak up. Policies were written. A small library opened in town because someone decided education was the best defense against cycles of theft and shame. Ngoy continued to send money home. She continued to call her brother on Sundays to wish him a week of strength. She did not think of herself as a hero. She called herself simply someone who had refused to watch another person be made small. That refusal, in its quietness, had been enough to unspin a dangerous pattern. The final image was not the glossy portrait of an engagement party gone wrong. It was a sunset over the estate, warm and steady. Amika stood on the terrace, hands in his pockets, and looked out over the grounds with Mama Chenier by his side. 2 figures below moved along the garden path, Ngoy pruning and Chukwo passing in the other direction with a bag of school supplies in hand. They nodded, the kind of exchange that says everything and asks for nothing. Amika turned to Ngoy and said, honestly, "You shattered expectations." She lifted an eyebrow, a smile crossing the plainness of her face. "I only did what needed to be done." He smiled back. No fireworks needed. "You saved us from what we almost accepted." She shrugged. "People should be treated better. That is all."
Her answer was small and exact. It was the kind of sentence that holds the moral of a story without trying to polish it into rhetoric. It acknowledged the title of their shared evening, the feared fiancé, the new maid who shattered expectations, without embellishment. For those who had watched with breath held, the gratitude was enough. If this moved you, subscribe for more stories where courage changes everything.